I was trying really hard to think of the many different ways that I could physically hold and press my brush against the surface of the watercolor paper. For a lot of people, if you were to give them a brush and some watercolor, usually their first impulse is to take the brush and paint a downward stroke. But the thing is, you can't stick with that all the time. And so when I was using, especially the bigger brushes, I was really trying to avoid that typical downward stroke because too much of that can lead to your painting looking monotonous, that all the articulation feels too similar. Especially with the big brush, a lot of the time I wasn't even making a stroke as much as I was just taking the shape of the brush and just pressing it against the surface, almost like it was a rubber stamp. And then other times, what I would do is put the brush down, but then I would have the brush tumble across the page, almost like the brush was doing a somersault across the surface of the paper. I make a pretty conscious effort to paint in different directions. So instead of that typical downward stroke, sometimes I would put the brush down, push it upwards, make it go diagonally. And so every single variation that you do with your brushwork, it's a different language, a different feeling, because that variety, I think, is what makes a watercolor painting so exciting. I've definitely seen paintings where I just know everything was painted with one brush in the same direction. And so I think really mixing it up and making those strokes as diverse as possible is hugely helpful. I think what's hard about doing these less typical brushstrokes is that they are really unpredictable, because if you have a stroke and you do that typical downward stroke, you usually know about how that's going to look. But if you let your brush just roll across the surface in this strange manner, you don't always know what's going to happen. But for me, that lack of predictability keeps it fun, keeps it exciting, so that every time I put down a brushstroke, I really am reacting to the previous one. And it doesn't become this mechanical process that you're just repeating over and over again. When I paint with a Sumi brush, I love pushing the Sumi brush in so many different directions, trying to really take advantage of creating the twists and turns that are possible with a brush that is this soft. I really don't know precisely the type of stroke it's going to make, but it's in that spontaneity that you get a wide range of shapes that you wouldn't be getting if you had complete control over the mark. Relinquishing that control with your Sumi brush also means that you get far more gesture and spontaneity. With every brushstroke, I really try to get a wide variation in terms of width. Every brushstroke I put down, I really try to shift the width of the line. A very big concern for me with watercolor painting is how much water is in my brush. This is actually much more about throwing down shapes than it is about showing individual brushstrokes that are distinct. As the painting progresses, I incrementally move towards these details. And that really changes my brush technique and how I hold the brush. Now I'm really trying to get a ton of control. I also slow down my pace a lot. You just can't make these little prickly details in a very quick manner. You need to be completely in control. The way I structure my painting technique is through very, very thin layers. I like layers because I feel like the process is building incrementally. For so many years, I always felt like watercolor had to be very flowy and soft strokes. It wasn't until I did a lot of experimentation with dry brushing, using very little water in my brush, that watercolor started to make sense. Because watercolor is so fluid, I oftentimes felt like the water in my brush just was flowing out so quickly that the painting was far ahead of where my mind was.